maybe get the ball rolling. We did have one question emailed into us. Let's see if I can pull that up. So this question is for you, Sean. The question is, this flower was seen in North Carolina. Now, the person who emailed this in isn't super sure if this is native to the States or not native, but they're wondering if you could hazard any guess as to what this plant might be.
Yeah, that looks like Liatris spicata, which is meadow blazing star. Now, that all being said, was it South Carolina or North Carolina we mentioned?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. So there are a whole variety of Liatris native to North America. So there's a number of them that come into Ontario. So Liatris spicata, which is this kind of spike-like one, is the most common one. But as we kind of head into the Midwest and further south, there's well, I could rhyme off all the Latin names. I'm not sure I remember all the common names, but Liatris pycnostachya and Liatris ligostylia, Liatris microcephala, and they're all kind of, what's interesting about the Liatris, they all have very specific ecological niches. So some of them kind of like it more wet, some of them like it in drier environments, some are sandier, some of them are a little bit further south. So certainly there's some good books that you can look at if you want to kind of look at some other features that I can't see in the photo as far as the basal leaves. So that would be the leaves closest to the ground. Just to make sure that down in North Carolina, there might not be another Appalachian species that I'm not as familiar with up here. But that's my guess, definitely Liatris. So Liatris and likely Liatris spicata. So meadow blazing star.
Awesome, thank you so much. Never fails to impress me how you just sort of know all these things.
No, lots I don't, believe me. So yeah, try my best.
A question in the chat is also for you, Sean. What time is the best time to prune apple trees?
Actually, now is a fantastic time. So if you even head down or up, I should say, from Guelph to different apple growing areas in Ontario, you'll see that kind of late February into March, there's a lot of pruning going on in orchards right now. And the reason this is a fantastic time to prune apple trees is that you can see the structure of the plant really well. So when you're pruning apples, you're usually trying to develop a structure for ideal fruiting and light to get to the parts of the canopy that you want to produce leaves and flowers and fruit. But also one of the other benefits is this time of year, just before the sap starts to really move in the plants, when you cut something off, you're kind of removing something that you didn't want. If you wait till later on, until the sap starts moving and the leaves start to fill up, the plant took all that energy and relocated it to a branch that you were just going to cut off anyway. So basically you can cut off the stuff you don't want now, and then when the plant starts to move its sap and open up its buds and leaves, all that energy is going into the parts of the plant that you do want, that you wanted to keep. So that's why this is a great time of year to prune apples. Also, we're past the coldest part of the winter, hopefully. But once we've gone through many cold periods like we have, the plants have fully hardened off. So you're less likely to have freeze damage to wounds. The plant tissues basically and the cells are very hardened off right now. So another really good reason for pruning this time of year. And probably the fourth is everyone gets excited about going into their gardens, and once April hits, you'll be weeding and you'll be digging and you'll be transplanting and everything else. You may not have time to prune your apples, so this is a good time to get out in the garden and do that when you can't do some of the other things that you'll be looking forward to doing.
Awesome, thank you. And a question in the chat that I've actually been wondering myself, I get this question quite a bit, is people have been noticing different colored flags or ribbons in different areas around the Arboretum. What do they signify? They're sometimes blue, sometimes yellow. And yeah, I have noticed that kind of in different parts of the Arboretum.
I can't give you a very specific answer because it sometimes depends. There'll be cases where us as an Arboretum staff will put certain ribbons on trees just to mark things quickly if we're doing inventory. But there's also a lot of research projects that happen here as well. So in some cases, there'll be things that are temporarily marked for students to do inventorying or certain trees that they're observing over and over again to study. And then also there's sometimes there's other projects involved that are going to require an evaluation of certain trees and just making sure they're being marked effectively. So generally speaking, there's no one answer to that question, but it usually just means there's something happening.
Awesome, thank you. And for any of you that maybe joined us a bit late, we are open to any questions you'd like to pop in the chat, or if you'd rather unmute yourself, that's more than welcomed. For now, I don't see any other questions in the chat, and we didn't get anything else emailed in. So maybe I'll give you guys a few seconds to type away if you're in the middle of putting in a question.
What kind of tea do you want? Kind of tea do you want?
All right, we got a question. Yeah.
So a few weeks ago, a hawk nabbed a mourning dove right in front of someone's front porch. So there's pictures that could be emailed for an ID. It seems too small to be a Cooper's hawk, so I'm wondering whether it's a juvenile sharp-shinned because of the eyebrow. Yeah, so pictures would be lovely in that case. At this time of year, we can get into some trouble of identifying hawks because the red-tailed hawk, which is a fairly common species throughout Ontario, the juveniles may be sporting a, actually the juveniles will be sporting not a red tail, so have a brown tail, which kind of goes against their namesake. But yeah, in this case, I'd be thinking probably you're kind of in this right realm of Cooper's, Sharpshin, or red tail would be your most common bets. Size-wise, definitely does help. Smaller would indicate a Sharpie, although there is a size range where the male Cooper could fall within an overlap of a large female Sharpie. So a picture would definitely help if you want to email it over here. Let me pop my email into the chat. And even if we don't get a chance to answer that right now, I could always email you back if there's a delay with the pictures. But that's always really exciting to see a little bit of action in your front yard. Hawk versus mourning dove.
Yeah, I had a Cooper's hawk get a mourning dove in my yard a few weeks back. It was, yeah, I actually witnessed it, so it was quite the scene.
Everyone's always following Chris's yard and his Cooper hawks fun times. That's lovely to hear that you also have one. I feel left out.
So can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sometimes my computer goes bizarre and makes weird noises. So this is generally a gardening questions, is it? General garden questions?
Yeah, so horticulture or animal or really nature questions, you're more than welcome to ask.
I thought maybe it was trees. Okay, so do you have any tips for getting rid of large areas of invasive like vinca, periwinkle, or ajuga?
Yes, I can relate definitely to the periwinkle. My backyard has a lot of decades of periwinkle growth from previous owners. I mean, there's a few different things you can do. It really depends on the soil and the terrain. I find with periwinkle, I actually just hand pick it. And it can be a lot of work initially, but I do find that the good thing with periwinkle, it doesn't go to seed. So you just have to stay on top of it. If you miss roots, you got to keep pulling. If you've got a really big space that's covered and it's fairly flat, you can try covering it with cardboard. So some thick cardboard right over top of it, and then you can actually put mulch right over top of that, and that will kind of block out the light and choke that out. The only thing to be careful of if you've got lots of mature trees is that you have to be really careful that you're not putting a super thick layer of mulch around the root zone of the trees as well, because that can actually starve them for some oxygen as well. But those would be the two main things to try. There are chemical means, but not really the nicest things you want to be using, and not always 100% effective either. So I find that there's no silver bullet, especially with the pulling and even with the covering of the cardboard. You're sometimes still going to get the energy from the roots trying to put up a few new shoots. But as long as you keep getting them before they build their strength, you can put a pretty big dent in those populations. My experience, I've cleared probably about half an acre of vinca, and it felt like there was no way I could win that battle. It just felt impossible. And I'm now finding 2 years in that I've mostly got it under control. I just have to pull a couple sprigs and it's almost given up. So I wish you could just do it the first time and be done with it. But that's kind of the challenge with those things for sure. So does that help answer your question a little bit?
Well, it's 2 years. That's pretty good for a big area like that. That's really good. Yeah, I had a couple of big areas that I did something very similar to that. And like you, I'm still going around pulling those little bits, keep popping.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they're so beautiful. You know, the leaves are so green and shiny, and the flowers are so beautiful. So I have left a couple of areas where I know I can control it pretty easily.
Mhm.
But if it's an area that's been there for a while, it's so rooted and it's so tangled roots, it's almost impossible to cover up. And
That, yeah, yeah.
and with a juga, they make so many babies. You know, those beautiful stalks that they send up that we love to see are just full of seeds. And the next
Yes.
thing you know, you see these tiny, teeny little babies, baby ajugas coming up everywhere.
That is definitely the challenge with things that also go to seed. And I think the nice thing with the periwinkle is that it only spreads vegetatively. It rarely sends out seedlings. With the juga, you don't have that that luxury. So with that and any invasive, this applies for things like garlic mustard and things that we see broadly more ecological problems. But is trying your best to never let it go to seed, and that's again a lot of work, especially initially. I find for myself it's kind of a little weekly routine where it's almost like my goal to find, oh, you're flowering, I found you, you snuck in there, and you just make sure to not let that ever go to seed. And it's a lot of work initially, but it becomes less and less work every week. And that's really to kind of do it without using chemical means. Those are kind of the options. I'm not sure what your terrain or your topography is like, whether you can actually do things like tilling or covering with plastic or things like that. Those are some other options. The plastic really only works well when it gets a lot of sun, though. It takes a long time to kill it unless you can really get the heat from the sun to almost solarize the periwinkle underneath. And then, of course, when you're doing that, you're also cooking a lot of other organisms in there, which isn't ideal. So yeah, unfortunately, not a silver bullet, but it sounds like what you've been doing is the right thing. You just got to stick to it, and eventually you can win the battle, or at least get close.
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. And I did get pictures of that mystery hawk, and I'll share that for you guys. Hopefully everyone can see that. And this is actually pretty cool. So we had originally were thinking along the lines of Cooper's, Sharpie. I threw out maybe Redtail, but by the size of this actually looks a lot like a Merlin to me. So Merlin is one of our smaller falcons that are actually somewhat common in neighborhoods, especially if there's lots of forested area where you are. So a couple things are kind of saying Merlin to me. In this case, one of those is those very long dangly toes. Seems more falcon-like to me. Nice slender pointed wings, which for an accipiter, which sharp-shinned hawks are, this is kind of reminiscent. But the size, that Merlin is just about the same size, a bit bigger than the mourning dove it's on. So for that small, compact size, it has a lot of falcon features. I'm thinking that this is a Merlin, which is super cool to see. They are amazing predators, and they're often heard before they're seen. They're very well known for their characteristic just yelling, which I'm not Chris, I can't do bird calls, unfortunately, but they basically yell a lot of the time when they're in breeding season. So if you have these in your area, especially a pair, fast forward to the spring, you should hear some nonstop yelling, which may be a little bit not super pleasant in the morning, but I think they sound really cute, especially if you know it's a breeding thing. So I am very sure that this is a Merlin, which is a lovely find. And so that seems to have cleared up that question, hopefully, Anne. That sheds some light into your mystery hawk that turned out to be a falcon. And it looks like we don't have any other questions coming in.
Michelle, there's a kind of a follow-up question to that one, from Anna. She said that I wondered that, but it's not grayish on the back.
Oh, so it looks like it's wet, which sometimes plays around with the colors. And the Merlins can be a bit variable on their backs for the coloring. You'd mentioned the eyebrow too, which you're right, a juvenile sharpshin would have a bit of a white eyebrow there, but so does the Merlin. The size is really the thing that's throwing me the most towards Merlin. It also just the size and shape of it speaks more falcon than hawk to me. Hopefully that helps. I'm not sure if we've got any questions off the Facebook stream, Brad.
Thanks, Michelle. It was just a real mystery because I've never seen anything like that. In the back, we often find piles of feathers all over the place because we have lots of bird feeders back there and there's plenty of mourning doves all the time. But it was just so bizarre to see. And then it was barely about the same size as that mourning dove. So then I wondered about the Merlin, but it didn't look gray enough to me. And I don't know about the beak. I didn't think it was hooked enough, but anyway, I just was astounded and standing at the front door watching it as it was killing the mourning dove that was struggling.
It can be a bit gruesome to watch, but it's, in my opinion, kind of an exciting, real natural thing that can happen in your backyard if you provide the right settings for wildlife to come in. So thank you for sharing that observation. It's really lovely.
No, I didn't find it gruesome at all because I know that if they don't find things like that to eat, they'll die. So they can't eat the bird seed the way the other birds do, and that's what they have to find. So I thought it was pretty awesome to see it.
Hopefully it sticks around and it nests somewhere in your neighborhood. That would be really lovely to be able to observe more in the day-to-day.
Well, there's some Cooper's hawks we sometimes see in the back. And
awesome.
Yeah, too bad I should have, I didn't even report that on the bird count or on Merlin because I wasn't sure. But anyway, I did do the bird count all those 4 days.
Awesome. Thank you for that. For any of you maybe that don't know, recently there was the great backyard bird count, which everyone is encouraged to submit data for their backyard bird feeder. So that's lovely that you're able to participate in that. My bird feeder was unfortunately empty the past few days by birds, not by seeds. So that was kind of sad.
I've been keeping an eye on the Facebook, and there are no questions on the Facebook side, but maybe I should just take this opportunity to introduce myself because you guys probably recognize Sean and Michelle, but there's a new face here, which is me. So I'm Brad. I recently started at the Arboretum about a month ago. I was at the last Ask the Arboretum, but I didn't really talk much. I'm the Anishinaabe environmental educator here at the Arboretum, which is kind of a new role here. So I'm working with the naturalist team. So Michelle, Chris, Jenny, and Kitty. And but I'm also doing this work, basically weaving in kind of traditional knowledge systems into the Arboretum and doing things like that. So lots of stuff coming up in the next few months and over the summer. So keep an eye out on that. I'll be doing some really exciting workshops that I'm starting to develop. That'll be probably late March and like April. So please come to those. I think they're going to be really wonderful. I'm super excited to present those. And yeah, if you have any questions on that side, I'd be happy to answer any of those kind of questions. A little bit about myself too. I'm also a really big chemistry nerd. So I really like chemistry. I'm really into natural history and also geology and stuff. So I'm kind of just all over the place with my interests, but yeah.
Welcome, Brad. But it's looking like maybe we are all out of questions unless somebody else is holding on to a question they've been wanting to pop in the chat or unmute yourself.
Oh, I could just keep talking all the time.
Awesome.
Talking. We're on the Saugeen Peninsula. So one of the things I'm always fighting well, maybe I shouldn't say fighting. One of the things that's always creeping into the garden is moss. And, moss looks very nice on the pathways between stones. But when it gets into the garden, I'm always turfing it up. I do put some wood ash on it. But is it something I should be worried about or just let it go?
I would say just let it go. certainly moss, it tends to, I mean, moss is very site specific, incredibly site specific as far as the whether it's on a mineral soil that's a higher pH or lower pH, the shade, the moisture. So it's usually only a problem in areas where it really wants to grow. That all being said, it's not, I mean, it's not a very aggressive plant. It usually can't compete with I guess more highly evolved plants when they're in a spot that they're doing well also. So I guess if you have concerns that it is starting to do that, and you've got plants that are a little weaker, and one issue that comes up a lot is moss getting into lawns. And moss usually only gets into lawns when the grass is growing in situations where it's not ideal anyways. It's a little bit too shaded, a little bit too damp. So you get the sparse patches in the grass, and that's where the moss comes in. It's not really the moss that's killing the grass. It's the grass sort of struggling first, and the moss takes over that ecological niche. And where you are in the peninsula, I mean, it's one of the most incredible places in the world to see different species of moss. So, so it might actually just be embracing some of them where they work, and in spots where you've got some prized plants you really want to grow, and the moss is competing a little bit, making sure to pull some of those moss sods away in those situations. But that's kind of the challenge with it. If you're in a spot where moss wants to grow, I've actually been thinking and dreaming about building a moss lawn at my house, and I don't think I have the conditions for it yet. It's a little bit too dry for it, but actually being able to kind of convert that, and even if you Google that online and look up moss lawns, there's some gardens that have specialized in that specifically, where they've just taken out grass species or lawns that aren't doing well in conditions that aren't suitable, and really encourage the moss to grow instead, and sometimes planted spring wildflowers so that they come up in between and then they die back. So you may be able to work with it depending on the situation you've got.
Do you have any idea if moss is a bad thing to have on your septic field?
I wouldn't think so. I have no idea, to be honest. I'm definitely not an expert in that, but certainly moss is I mean, it just has a very thick kind of turf-like coating over the grass. Doesn't actually, or sorry, over the ground. It doesn't actually send in true roots or anything like that. So there is a bit of filtration still happening, certainly as water passes through or rain passes through. But I really can't think of any reason why it would cause a problem. So I think you should be okay there.
Because it's gradually taking over the septic.
Like just on the surface. Yeah, and that should be okay. It could be because it's basically water is heading in that direction, so it stays a little bit moist a little bit longer. And if you've got some shaded conditions as well, that's again perfect for moss. So it might be something that you can just work with. But the moss itself is not it's not a bad thing. It's not like a pathogen or anything else that's going to cause any problems. It's actually just another green plant that usually doesn't do well in a lot of environments because it gets out competed by things that are more vigorous. But in those really specific sites, again, it's something that you might be able to embrace a little bit and work with, and have a beautiful green carpet that's moss instead of grass or a different type of ground cover.
But what you said about being on the peninsula, I mean, the mosses last summer were just amazing. I mean, they're just glowing. And I mean, even through the winter, you know, if you can't come across an area where the snow is pulled back, or you get a more vertical surface, the mosses are just glowing. It's unbelievable. So
well, they love the that extra little bit of humidity. They definitely brighten up after rains, and certainly the snow, that the cool conditions, the moisture and the temperature, really conducive to moss growth. And again, where you are, I mean, this could turn into there's some fantastic books, for example, on all the different types of mosses. So maybe something that was less of a garden plant, you might actually find some of the beautiful gems like rose moss and fern moss, and there's some really incredible species that you'll be able to see out on your hikes. You might even have some in your yard that you could actually kind of embrace. I'm actually, again, I'm kind of biased because I'm doing that in my yard. I'm big into ferns and mosses, so I'm actually trying to encourage them wherever I can get them to grow. So yeah, if you've got those conditions, you're also lucky because the average backyard in, for example, Guelph isn't great for growing most moss species. So yeah, you might have an option to become a passionate moss gardener over the years. They do exist. There are books you can actually buy specifically on moss gardening. So something you might want to look into.
Oh, nice.
What about the little bears that live in moss?
the little critters that you see, those microscopic creatures that live in mosses. I've seen
Oh,
pictures of, they look like little bears or, and the lichens too. I mean, the lichens, but yeah, I don't know if you've seen the picture of that, the little, it's a microscopic creature. You know, when you see these pictures of microscopic things that
oh,
they look like, you know, they look like critters from another planet or something like that.
those are the, is it the tardigrades? Is that what they're
Yeah, I
called?
think it's tardigrades that look
Tardigrades,
like they're
yeah.
little bears. They're my like
Yeah, yeah.
favorite invertebrate tardigrades. They look so cute.
Yeah, yeah. I know, it's unbelievable. If only our eyes weren't so limited.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how much life is actually hidden amongst all these things. Just it's incredible, really. So
Well, I'll give somebody else a chance to talk, and if not, then we can talk again.
Lovely.
okay, sure. That sounds good.
There's another question in the chat asking about the meditation walking circle near the lilac garden over by Wild Goose Woods. Sean, do you know if there are any plans for it to be redone or kind of bring some new life into it?
Not that I'm aware of right at this very moment. I think what's in place now, certainly something we'll probably get in and try to maintain what's there. That at the time was sort of a one-off with the partners. So whether something comes from that again or it's expanded, it's a possibility, but I wasn't part of that original conversation. So I'm not entirely sure what the answer is to that, but to be determined, I guess would be the best I can do.
Some more love for moss gardens in the chat, which is lovely.
All right.
And another question is, are you able to address patio raised gardens? What type of soil is best for vegetable / small gardens, small gravel pieces surface? I think the question is, what would you fill a garden bed with?
I guess I would say this is sort of a non-answer, but it kind of depends. If it's a big raised bed and it's fairly open to the ground, so it drains really well. So I'm thinking the difference between a raised bed that has like a small port for drainage, like a big pot basically, versus something that's just a raised box that all of the base level of the soil actually interacts with the ground beneath it. And the reason I bring that up is because usually with pots, for example, we try not to put too much pure soil or compost in there because it can get really heavy and waterlogged and not drain well, and you can actually have root rot problems. So you're usually looking at more soilless mixes that have sometimes well composted bark components or peat, cocoa coir, and things like that. If it's a kind of just a typical big backyard bed, then you can actually do a blend where you're getting some compost or some topsoil even, and mixing in a bit of well-rotted cedar mulch could be an example. The bark shavings, when you put them in fresh, they actually pull a lot of nitrogen from the soil. So there's a microbial process that breaks down nitrogen in the carbon breaking down process. So it actually pulls it away from the vegetable plants that initial year. So the best thing you can do is if you're going to be adding things like bark shavings to kind of increase the airflow in the soil, to make sure it's not brand new. So try to get some composted bark shavings or well-wadded shavings. And as far as the recipe, it really varies depending on what the soil that you have around you to begin with is. So the pH of the soil, how heavy, if it's got clay or silt, and if you want to use 50% of that, then you're going to be mixing in other things, whether it's sheep manure or compost or bark shavings, to kind of create that perfect environment where you're getting the good pH and you're getting some good porosity. So that's the air movement throughout the soil, and something that holds moisture but not too much. So I know that's not, again, a perfect answer, but that's kind of what you're looking for. So one thing you can do is, if you're going to be adding soil from other parts of your garden, is to get a soil test done first to try to determine the pH and see how much clay, sand, silt there might be in there. If you've got a lot of clay, you're probably going to want to loosen it up a little bit with things like bark shavings or cocoa coir or a bit of peat. That's going to increase that organic matter. If it's really sandy, for example, and drains really, really quickly, you probably are going to want to add a bit more compost to try to increase that nutrition and water holding capacity a little bit. So hopefully that kind of answers your question, but it's nuanced, I guess I should say, depending on what you've got.
I feel like gardening season is just like inching towards us, and it's on my mind all the time.
Mhm.
Gardening. So soon.
Yep.
But with that, I'll open it up again if there are any more questions.
We have a Facebook question that is related back to the moss. So somebody asks, we have moss in between flagstones and we want to fill those spots. So is there anything that you'd recommend to suggest to encourage the moss to grow and expand?
Yeah, if you've already got the moss there, that's great. I actually have some between flagstones as well, and what I try to do sort of weekly again is just make sure I pull any weeds that might get established in there, because once they do get established, they'll kind of start to shade that canopy over a little bit. So that's kind of step one. Step two would be, if we're hitting really dry patches, go out and actually give your flagstones a little bit of a mist or a little bit of a drink with a watering can, just to really encourage that moss to fill in. And once it gets established, it's again pretty solid, except for the odd weed seeding that might sneak in there a little bit. There are, depending on the type of moss you have, and this is where some of the moss gardening books come in really handy. There are things like, for example, pouring a little bit of vinegar onto the soil between the cracks. And I know that sounds weird, but some mosses will very quickly colonize because they like that acidic soil, for example. Others, again, you can actually sprinkle limestone screenings in between and you'll encourage other types of mosses because of that. So how to know that is again, some of these books that can provide you some of the examples of the common mosses that you would be finding growing through there, or just observing if you've got limestone screenings between your flagstones, which you may have, because that's often what goes in between them. It is likely one that is growing well in those kind of more higher pH, higher calcium kind of conditions. So if you've got them, just work with them. One thing you can do, if you've got really, really thick patches in some areas, you can carve out little plugs, even just 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, and move them to other areas and slowly allow those to fill in if you want to fill more cracks more quickly. Commercially, there is a place in the US, I think, called Mossy Acres, that sells moss mats, and then you can cut them up and place them in. They usually grow them by, in some cases, there's some mosses you can actually put into a blender and blend them up and then spread them that way, and all those little pieces will actually grow into new sections. A lot of other mosses you actually need to grow from spore, which is really not practical to do in your backyard, or even commercially can be kind of challenging as well. But I would say start with what you got, because that's what wants to be there. And so you're lucky, and just kind of keeping that in as good a shape as possible, giving it a bit of a drink when it gets really dry, and helping to move a few of those little pieces to areas that are currently blank, and eventually it will fill in.
Lovely, thank you. And back to the raised garden bed question, someone's asking where they could obtain a soil test.
Mm-hmm. There's some soil tests you can actually do, you can pick up from garden centers, but here in Guelph, the Guelph Diagnostic Lab does do soil sampling. So it's laboratory services, Guelph Laboratory Services. If you Google that, there is a section for homeowners that has pest diagnostics. So you can actually send in a disease leaf sample, for example, and then also get some soil testing done. So those, that's one example I know locally, but depending on where you are in the province, there are other places that can provide those services as well. If you're not sure, go ask your local garden center, and they'd likely be able to help you out.
Lovely, thank you.
So we sometimes have rough grouse coming to our feeder. We feed in the winter for 3 or 4 months. Is there any particular food that we could put down for them? Or do they just enjoy the seeds as well?
I don't know. Sorry.
I have a bit of experience just because I have a rough grouse in my yard too. But Michelle, I'm not sure if you have anything, or Brad, that you...
I was just thinking they probably don't come up to the feeder, so spreading seeds on the ground, or if you have a platform feeder would probably help it. But
yeah,
Sean,
absolutely.
you're going to be the expert on this one again.
Well, I'm just learning about it myself, but cracked corn is definitely something they will eat. So again, as Michelle said, something you can spread on the ground. What they actually naturally eat in the winter, one of their favorite foods is actually poplar buds. So I know that's not a typical thing. You just go buy a bag of poplar buds to put in your bird feeder. But if you've got a local stand of aspens or poplars and a few branches or twigs with buds on them, that might be something else you can put out that they'll go right after. But certainly the cracked corn, black oil sunflower seeds, anything like that, that's probably maybe what they're going after already. But something like that on the ground can certainly help as well. But my experience has been the cracked corn has worked. And the poplar buds are maybe why they're in the area to begin with. There is a stand of aspens next to me, but yeah, that's one of their winter favorites, which I just learned. So thanks for asking the question. I got to share it now.
Do you have any suggestions for any particular places? As I said, we're on the Saugeen Peninsula. We're around Lion's Head. For getting native plants. I mean, sometimes you see native plants in the local nurseries, and I always wonder if they're really native or something. I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Up there specifically, I couldn't say for sure. I'm certainly there's some garden centers that would offer native plants up there. Native plant specialties. There are a number of places in Ontario that sell native plants. There's native plants in Claremont. There's Ontario Native Plants, which is a company. They've got an online website, onplants.ca. There's Grow Wild Native Plants. Those are just a few off the top of my head. I know there's more than that. There's a resource guide that I'm not sure if there's an updated copy online if you Google it, but the Society of Ecological Restoration of Ontario has a native plant resource guide that I know they've been working to update that lists a bunch of native plant nurseries in the province, so you kind of know locally where you might be able to go. So I would say even just starting with that, native plant nurseries in Ontario, a quick Google search might list a few more off that I didn't mention that you'd be able to get to. As far as how close to you, again, I'm not entirely sure. I know there's another one in Guelph, as I just think about it, called Origin Native Plants, and I think they do some mail order as well. So they have a website, you can pick some out and they'll send some to you. Otherwise, you might have to travel a little bit, but hopefully that's a good place to start. And certainly those native plant specialty nurseries really do obviously focus on native plants, so they tend to know them quite well and offer a selection that you wouldn't necessarily be able to find in most common garden centers.
And what was that again? The Society of Ecological
Restoration.
Restoration. Oh, good.
Yeah. Now, if you Google that and native plant resource guide, you might be able to find one of the older copies online that would list some of those nurseries as well.
And like you, I'm hoping to get more ferns into the garden.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I love ferns. And again, the Saugeen Peninsula is just a fabulous place to find ferns.
One of the best spots in the world.
Yeah,
It really is. It's incredible.
Yeah, we even have in the bush behind our place, we have quite a bit of the heart tongue fern.
Oh, wow. You're so lucky.
Yeah.
A globally endangered plant in your backyard. That's pretty special. So,
and I mean, most people, I point it out to people all the time, and they think, oh, that doesn't even look like a fern. And of course it doesn't look like a fern either. It's
no.
Yeah.
Well, and one note, actually, you'll sometimes see heart tongue fern for sale in garden centers. And it's actually not the American heart's tongue fern, it's the European heart's tongue fern. And it often will be sold as a native species because it is actually the same species of plant, but there's different varieties that grow on the different continents. And what's interesting is that the European version, which is I think Asplenium scolopendrium variety scolopendrium, it does really well in kind of garden settings. Just regular kind of golden culture, grows well in pots. That's why it's sold. The American one, which is Asplenium scolopendrium variety americanum, is very, very site specific. So in your backyard on the peninsula where you've got the rocks and the moss and the shade, it's very, very particular with where it grows and very hard to cultivate outside of that. So that's one of those ones that I usually try to tell people, if you see it for sale in the garden center, it's probably not the native one, even though it's being sold as the native one. But that's what also makes the ones we have around here so special. They're genetically actually a little bit different. They have different number of chromosomes, but they're almost similar, almost perfectly similar looking in all other ways.
Yeah, they're pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
John, you're a Jedi wizard master of plants. It's incredible. I'm so glad I'm here.
No.
Well, we got two questions. One is for me. So somebody asked, will the workshops be open to non-U of G students? Yep, they'll be open to the public. So if you go to the Arboretum's webpage, actually now I need to actually go and do it myself. So you go to the Arboretum webpage, and then you will go to, is it education and events, and then workshops. And then that will be the page where the workshops will be posted, and then you can sign up from there. So yeah, just keep an ay out for that. Those should be coming out within the next couple of weeks. And then we also had a question on Facebook as well. So Les says, regarding the emerald ash borer blight moving through the province, will this be similar to the Dutch elm blight where trees are still being infested decades later? Or will the beetle die off after the ash in the area dies?
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting. I wrote an article probably back in 2005 when emerald ash borer was kind of first becoming more known in the province, and the fear that ash trees would go extinct. Now, certainly there's a lot of ash trees being lost, and absolutely there's areas where we're losing them completely. The one thing that I would say is similar to Dutch elm disease, and this is what I had mentioned at the time, was that the good thing with both ash and elm is that they're really good at colonizing disturbed sites, regenerating, putting out seed when they're fairly young. So Dutch elm disease wiped out the majority of our large mature elm trees, but it usually doesn't infect and kill the trees until after they've already gone to seed. So we're still seeing lots of elm trees all over the place in Ontario. They still grow up. They can reach 10, 12 years old, start putting out seed, and then new seedlings come up. The problem is we don't see them get to be big trees before they die, but the population is still out there. With ash trees, there's woodlands where we've seen all the mature ash completely die, but the understory is filling up with ash seedlings, and unfortunately buckthorn and garlic mustard in some places too. But the hopeful thing with those young ash trees is that they'll also reach mature enough age that they can put out a few seeds before the emerald ash borer comes and gets them as well. And what we're likely going to find is that emerald ash borer will move through the province, take out most of their food sources, so the bigger trees. Other parts of the province where the emerald ash borer population used to be higher, but is now lower because they've moved on. So those trees will mature over a number of years. Likely we'll see emerald ash borer cycle back through, and it'll become kind of part of that natural cycle in Ontario. But the hope is that a lot of situations where these trees exist, they won't go completely extinct. They just won't, in the short term, get as big and old as they may have. With really rare species, there's definitely more concern with things like pumpkin ash, which was a very rare tree in Ontario to begin with. Black ash, obviously, which is a critically important tree in our province as well. So it's definitely a big loss to lose a lot of the mature trees, but fingers crossed, we'll still see some of those young trees putting out seedlings in these newly opened canopies where the big trees died, and flowering and putting out seed before they get killed. So we'll still have ash, but ecologically, that's one of those things that remains to be seen. That's just theoretical until we see how it unfolds. But the positive thing has been in some of the areas in extreme southwestern Ontario where a lot of ash have died, we're seeing a lot of young ash still there. So that's hopeful that they have a chance to mature before the beetles come back around, basically. That was a long-winded answer. I'm not sure that, but yeah, I guess maybe just to contrast that, just to tie that all together, something like chestnut blight. So American chestnuts are very rare. They're endangered. Chestnut blight came in much earlier, but chestnuts take a long time to mature and set seed. So if they're infected before they set seed, then you're not getting that young seedling population replacing them. So with things like ash and elms, because they're good at regenerating disturbed sites, more of an early successional species, that might become the new norm for them. I worry about things like oak wilt, which is now very close to Ontario. It's at the Canadian border. That's one of those examples. Oaks don't put out acorns till much later in life than an elm would. So oak wilt might kill a lot of trees off before they can put out seedlings, and then eventually you don't have a population left. So that's probably one I'm a little bit more worried about right now.
Fingers crossed it doesn't make its way to
Yes.
Ontario.
Yes, absolutely.
Kind of on this theme of plants being threatened by things, there's a question if the arboretum is threatened by Lamancha disbar or gypsy moths. Because in the Hildman County, their nest hang from branches. And apart from torching them, is there another solution?
Yeah, thankfully this year I'm not too worried about it. The last 2 years have probably been the worst in the arboretum that we've seen. But the populations have taken a big hit. There's a lot of parasites that were actually infecting the caterpillars last year. So even though there's a lot of feeding, a lot of defoliation earlier in the year, there was not a lot of egg laying, at least compared to the 2 previous years. So I can walk around the arboretum right now and look at the trunks of oaks and birches and find the odd egg sac. But this time last year, they were loaded. They're everywhere. So the good thing is that these natural cycles, trees, if they're healthy and established, they can handle defoliation for a year or 2 and then recover from it. And usually with nature, these things always balance out. It just always depends on how quickly they balance out and what you lose in the meantime. So this is another example, kind of like Emerald ash borer, where these moths are actually moving through the province, and the populations kind of ebb and flow in different areas. They kind of eat their food source, they'll move on. There's situations where we're trying to control them in cities with spraying and things like that as well, that knocks them back. But this year, the natural parasites basically have started to knock them back on their own, which is great to see. The birds have been eating what's left. And hopefully this year it's just a few here and there, but not a big problem. It's really something I've never worried about here in my time, outside of the odd nibble on a leaf. And the last 2 years were that kind of boom population, but it's starting to do the crash right now, which is good. I don't know if you'll be as lucky in Haldimand County. You might be actually reaching the boom phase this year, but certainly it's something that if the trees are healthy, they can handle it, and that decline will hopefully occur within the year after that.
I also want to add something I found pretty interesting in the summer. So, well, you kind of touch upon like what are solutions to get rid of the gypsy moth, and I think really the best solution to me is just if you put like a burlap sack or something on the bottom of the tree, they come down in the canopy during the night, and then you can just go and hug it and squish all of them basically. Mm-hmm. And that's not that's not chemicals or anything bad. But I was really noticing something really interesting last June, is that when I would squeeze some of the gypsy moths, because I walk around with a rock hammer, so sometimes I would just go to trees and just do this, which I felt kind of bad about. But a lot of the times they squish green. But this last June, I was noticing a lot of them were squishing like black and like really goopy. And I'd looked into it, and it's actually some kind of fungal pathogen. So, this is kind of similar to what Sean was saying, that kind of nature's taking its course because their populations are getting so dense. They basically can spread sickness between themselves a lot easier. So that's something I found pretty interesting too. So if you see it this summer and you squish them, they squish black, they're infected with something else.
There you go. That's true. Yeah, and you may have actually seen too, like they'll look like kind of withered caterpillars sort of hanging like a question mark shape all over trees this past year towards the end of the season. A lot of those dying from that fungal pathogen, and again, those aren't mating and laying eggs. So that's kind of the positive thing, not seeing as many egg cases this year, at least in Guelph, as we did the last 2 years, and that's really positive. So as Brad said, nature usually balances it out. It just depends on how long it takes and how severe the consequences are in the meantime.
We have a question from Facebook. So Les says, my daughter has a property in Oliphant, which is located on a large glacial dune, which sounds really cool. Mm-hmm. I found a tulip tree on this property last year. Is this unusual for the area? I thought they were more local to the southern parts of Ontario.
Yeah, that's there's a populations of tulip trees that grow on shoreline dunes along Lake Huron. So certainly Pinery Park and a little bit further north. So it wouldn't be completely far-fetched to think it's there. But how it got there would be the other part of the question. These days, you never know if someone's done a bit of a guerrilla planting and extended something further north, or if that's actually something that's regenerated. I'm not sure how big the tree is, but through natural migration of a tree species, which is something we would see. Again, that habitat is similar to how they're growing a little bit further south. So that's something, yeah, I would actually personally want to look into whether there's any other reports of tulip tree growing specifically in that area. But it doesn't extend beyond reason to think that they couldn't do well there in that situation, considering where they're growing further south. Yep, and trees have to move eventually, right? So we often look at where they were growing at a point of time and saying this is where they grow, but tulip tree seeds fly in the wind, they can float on water. So it's very possible that those trees are migrating.
The slow migration of trees.
Mm-hmm.
And it's looking like, once again, we've gone through all the questions. So if that's it for you guys, I want to thank you for all the really interesting questions we got. You guys never fail to ask a ton of really good questions.
Could I just make another comment?
Definitely, go ahead.
I watched this presentation of some webinars from the States, from a university. I've forgotten the name, but they were really, really good. And one of the presentations was had to do with birds and caterpillars and trees. And well, native plants sustaining caterpillars to feed the birds. I mean, it was just an amazing presentation about how the one thing sustains another, as we all know. But one of the things that he did emphasize was how amazing oak trees are for sustaining caterpillars, for regenerating a garden, or you know, they were emphasizing getting rid of these massive lawns that you see people like to have around their house and spend hours cutting with their machine. And I just found it absolutely fascinating about the caterpillars and the native plants, the native shrubs and flowers that sustain caterpillars to feed the birds, and how once you do that in your garden, you see how much it sustains the birds again. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, oaks have been definitely getting a lot of increased press over the years with that study. Basically, it was Douglas Tallamy who did the study looking at different Lepidoptera or caterpillar moth species that feed on different plants, and oaks was number one. One of the big reasons oaks was number one is there's actually a lot of oaks in North America. So not only just a lot of species, but much of the US is covered with different oak species. So they just support broad ecosystems. One thing I always do point out with those lists, though, is that as excited as we get to be with oaks, because they cover so many, number 7 on the list, number 8, number 14, in some cases there's a plant that only supports 1 or 2 caterpillars, but it's the only plant that caterpillar can live on. So yeah, getting those oaks in there, also making sure you get some other plants and other diversity. That's kind of nature's buffer, biodiversity. And again, like you said, it kind of filters all the way up to the birds and beyond. So yeah, no, very, very neat stuff. And it's fantastic that we're starting to think about these things now and look at them in this kind of way. You know, it's part of this broad ecosystem that we're all a part of.
And all the slides that he showed of the different caterpillars was just mind-boggling. It was just fabulous. Anyway, I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed today. Thank you so much. And Bradley, good luck. Your enthusiasm is infectious, so I'm sure you'll be great.
Yes. That's right.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a beautiful note to end on. Always nice to encourage planting native trees to support native everything. And if you enjoyed today's session, I'd like to invite you to join us next month, because we do host these little meetings once a month on the last Tuesday around 11. So you're more than welcome to tune in then if you have any more questions. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.